Hey, real quick, we're going to be in 1 Timothy while Julie's doing this, but I want to read something from 1 Peter. We were going to do this earlier. I just want to point something out so that you've got this in the back of your head. So this is 1 Peter 3. First Peter 3, 1 through 8.
I'm sorry.
Just a second. There. Okay. Here's just what I want you to hear. This is 1 Peter 3. I want you to think, does this sound similar or different from what we just read in Paul? Okay, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external. Do you hear that? Adorning. The braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, the clothing that you wear. Does that sound familiar? Very similar language. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as to the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Okay. Word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We are in 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 15. So I'd like you to flip back there. We've already read it. I think I said this already, but today what we're talking about is Paul's problem with women, part 2. Okay? But before we start, I want you to remember where we started from. Okay? And when I say started from, I mean over the past year and a half. We've actually worked through the Gospel of Mark, looking at the ministry teachings of Jesus. We've worked through the book of Acts, looking at how the Holy Spirit builds his church. Okay? And now we're in the book of 1 Timothy, looking at Paul's letter to a pastor, Timothy, in a small house church type of setting in Ephesus. So we're kind of getting the whole gamut of how Jesus' ministry works, the early church looks, and then what actual communication instructions to the church look like. The purpose of everything we're doing is to actually teach you how to read the Bible for yourselves, so that you can learn how to read and pray and hear God's voice better, so that you can respond better, so that your faith can actually make a difference in how you live, which that was the big thing for the early Christians. Their faith in Jesus made a massive difference in how they lived. And that is one of the big problems with the American church. For most American Christians, our faith doesn't make any difference in how we live. The way we live is largely indistinguishable from people who don't have faith. And that's why people are so fed up and frustrated with the American church. So if we're going to learn how to lead into that old thing, we got to learn how to read. Okay? Now, this is our second week in a very difficult passage. And as I said last week, it's difficult to know for sure what's even being said. So when you run into those scenarios, one of the things, you guys have already started doing it this week, you've chewed on it. Like you sit with it. And you keep reading it. And you keep thinking about it. And what you start to do is there's going to be some things that continue to be unclear. But one of the things that's helpful is to focus on not what's unclear, but what is clear. And oftentimes, if you can start to get some things where you're like, oh, I'm not sure about this, this, and this, but I am sure about, like this, and this. It starts to help you at least know what parts you can lean on a little bit more, because it feels clear. It doesn't feel like we're building something on a really wooden interpretation. In other words, let's find the pieces and the components that aren't wooden that we're like, oh, we definitely see that. And so that's what I want to try to do today. 4 basic points. And I don't know if we're going to get through it all, but we're going to try. Okay, so the first of all, I want to remind you there's 3 basic options. This is what we talked about last week, so let's review. The second thing is there is one really big question, and it's a historical question that most of us don't think about, and it's really important to do so. Third, there's a case study in the cultures. We're going to read that sheet that I passed out to you. Fourth, we're actually going to start to talk about what Paul is saying in the text and how it might be good news. So basic options, one big question, case study in cultures, what Paul is saying in the text. How could it be good news? All right. 3 basic options. If you were here last week, what I said is when you come to this text, you have 3 basic options about how to interpret it. The first option is Paul's wrong. All right? And the difficulty, this is review, the difficulty with just saying, oh, Paul is clearly wrong here. Part of the problem is that Paul is actually pretty closely connected in terms of ideas to Peter, and both of them are pretty closely connected to Jesus and to the history of the early church. So if we start saying like Paul is wrong in this passage, it's actually very difficult if somebody who's a skeptic says, oh really? What is your arbitrary, independent, objective measuring stick that allows you to say this part's wrong and this part isn't? How do we know that what Paul says about women here, that's wrong, but what Paul says about loving God and loving your neighbor, that's timeless? See what I'm saying? A skeptic will actually say, where do you get your standard? And the answer is most of the time, our standard comes from our culture. And one of the things we know is we should all be dubious of our culture. So all of that was last week. Basically, I was saying, if you go down that path, you're going to find it's difficult and to actually be intellectually consistent. All right? And often people who go down that path, in other words, I'm going to cut out all the pieces that I don't agree with. Sometimes it might actually be more helpful just to go, maybe I'm actually not a Christian. Like if this is what Christians believe and I think that's wrong, maybe I'm just not a Christian. Okay? So, that's the first thing. This thing is wrong. The second option was, this thing is actually timely. Or it's timeless. Those are the second 2. And if it's timely, that means like, listen, it's not necessarily right for now, but it might have been right for back then. Does that make sense? In other words, there might have been a setting or a context where it actually was right. It did make sense. For instance, Paul gives some examples. 1 Corinthians 8. All right, he's driving me nuts. Is there any way we can take away the whatever's loud and clunky, because it's going to drive Matt and Tiff nuts too, probably. Okay. If in 1 Corinthians 8, let me give you an example. Paul says, hey, it's totally fine to eat meat sacrificed to idols. But if you've got somebody in your church that came out of a really idol-ridden like situation, there might be places where it doesn't make sense. You shouldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols. What he's actually doing is he's saying context fits. So it's possible that this might have been a specific contextual thing. In this case, it actually made sense for what he was saying, but later when the conditions change, you don't need to take that part seriously anymore because the context is different. Okay, that's a possibility. It's timely. Now the other option is to say, no, it's timeless. It's more of a creational thing. It's for all time. But here's my point. For either one of those approaches, what you need to be able to do is understand how it would have made sense at that time. Does that make sense? In other words, most of us, when we read this, we're operating primarily out of our culture. And so one of the things that's really, really helpful is to go like, as much as possible, I need to get back into that culture to see how they would have heard it and how this might possibly have been really like at least better news than maybe I think. Does that make sense? So no matter where you land, if you land on, I just think this is wrong, that one's tough for different reasons. This one is the last two, timely or timeless. It's tough because you actually have to do the hard work of putting yourself in another person's shoes and going, how might this have actually been really, really good, positive, and appropriate for that time, okay? So what I want to do, that's the first thing today, the review. Just remember there's three options. Whichever of those second two options you take, timely versus timeless, we still have to make sense of how it could be good and appropriate. Way to go, Antonio. All right. Second, there is a really big historical question. Okay, if any of you guys read the Rodney Stark article, which was long, I posted on Slack. Very, very good. I know Malachi read a chunk of it. I don't know if anybody else did. But basically, Rodney Stark, he's not a Christian. He's a historian. Okay, he wrote Rise of Christianity, the Role of Women. That's the article that he talks about. Here's his observation. He says, hey guys, in the Roman Empire, we know, and he does his sociology, historiography, makes his case. He's like, we know that men outnumbered women pretty significantly. There was a shortage of women. And then he's got a theory, which he quotes social scientists. He's like, guess what? Anytime you find a culture where there's a shortage of women, where they're like scarce goods, what you typically find is repression of women, control of women. They're like a scarce substance, commodity. And he says, so the Roman Empire, shortage of women, pretty controlling and maybe repressive for a lot of women. And he says, like, here's an example. They reconstructed 600 families, like who was in the family, at a place called Delphi, a town. And they did this because they found like places where they had buried them. And they like, so they've got, he's like, we were able to reconstruct 600 families.
Like DNA? Through DNA stuff?
Not DNA, no, inscriptions of like family. So like you go to where they, you know, the family trees were like genealogy. Through, usually it's through where they were buried. So if you go to a cemetery, you can, and you take dates on tombstones, you could reconstruct families. They did this at a place called Delphi. They were able to reconstruct 600 Roman families. Of those 600 Roman families, only 6 raised more than one girl. And he goes, guys, that doesn't happen naturally. He's like, why did they only raise more than one girl? What happened to all the other girls?
Yeah.
They were exposed. They were thrown out, or they entered the slave trade. They weren't raised. In other words, he goes, so if you look at that, he's saying, did the Romans value their women very highly? Well, not a lot of them. Okay? He says, so we know that men outnumbered women. Women's lives were very controlled. Very few Roman families actually raised more than one, like 1% raised more than one girl. Okay?
Because it was seen as dishonor to raise a girl.
Yeah, say it again.
It was seen as dishonor to raise a girl, so they would.
Yeah, so like a lot of them would have one, but there's a shortage of women. And then he goes, now listen. He goes, guess what? We look at early Christianity. Everybody's converting, and what we find is early Christianity was built largely on conversion, and guess what you find? A surplus of women. Historically indisputable. There's more women in the Christian church. In other words, the roles are reversed in the Christian church. And what he says then is he goes, clearly, for the early Christian women who had to convert in, and it was very costly to do so, they must have looked at something and said, this is incredible opportunity. So when we sit here and read passages like this and go, man, Paul sucks. He is so degrading to women. The early Christians, let me say it this way, the early Christian women for 3 centuries would have massively disagreed with you about Christianity. And what we need to go is, why? How? I don't understand. Does that make sense? The question we've got to answer? And Rodney Stark, who's not a Christian when he wrote this, I don't know if he is now, but he's like, hey guys, how come nobody doing history is answering this question? It's a really good question. So that's the question we want to think about, is like, we know that women massively opted into Christianity. And if we think women is a patriarchal, anti-woman faith, why on earth would women be getting into that? There must be something going on there that maybe we don't understand. Okay? So that's the question. All right. Now we're going to do the case study in culture. This is going to help us understand Roman culture, Christian culture. Okay? You ready for this? The handout? This handout, I'm going to read it. It's a summary, it's a 5-page summary of this book called From Shame to Sin. Why are you laughing?
Just 5 pages, like, it's a lot.
Dude, and it's brilliant. Did anybody, okay, first of all, who read this past week? That's why we're reading it now. I'm like, homework, read this article. Okay, Kevin DeYoung, who is an evangelical Christian, but he's a good writer, summarizes this book. I've been working through the book. I will tell you this. The book's great, but it's dense. Blake, you will love it. Okay? Most of you will not. Okay? Moving right along. Okay. Here's what I want you to do. I want to highlight some things. We're just going to read this together. I think I can do this in 10 minutes. Okay? So on the first page, look at the last sentence of the first paragraph. Harper explores in this book how the Christian sexual ethic, so despised and seemingly inconsequential in the first century, came to be codified in law by the 6th century. In other words, here's his point. Romans, pagans, particularly men, when they, and you're going to find out why. You're going to be like, oh, I know why Roman men didn't like it. Okay? Roman men, Roman thinkers, looked at early Christianity and said, this is utterly ridiculous. In fact, if you did this, entire society would come apart at the seams. No way this works. Okay? That's in the first, second, third century. By the time we're in the 6th century, all the Roman emperors are Christians, or identifying as Christians, and the Roman Christian, or the Christian ethic for like sexual relations. This is going to focus on sex, but you're going to see it's closely related to women. Women bore the brunt of the sex. But his whole point is, how do we make that cultural transformation? Okay? So, jump down to the, see where it says the revolution on the first page? That paragraph. The title of his book is From Shame to Sin. The title is about the transformation. It's not about some kind of like internal anguish about sin. The title is about the transformation from one moral system to a radically different moral system. From that one, the Roman system, which had shame as a social concept, to one, the Christian system, that had shame as a theological concept. It was actually sin. Difference from shame, honor, class, to sin. It cuts across all classes. Okay, here's the transformation in a nutshell. Read these 2 sentences. Sexual morality in the Roman Empire was permissive, based on social status. Sexual desire could be fulfilled in a myriad of ways. Now, under Christianity, sexual morality under the triumph of Christianity was austere. So from permissive, austere. It was based on gender, not class, and sexual desire could only be fulfilled in one way. And what he's asking, what this guy who's writing this book, Kyle Harper, he's like, how the heck do we explain such a massive cultural shift where all the people who controlled the culture radically disagreed with everything Christianity was about, and yet within 6 centuries, everything Christianity is about is now normalized in law. And he's not saying that's a good or a bad thing, by the way. He's just saying this is what happened. Okay. Blake.
Just a quick aside, this argument's done in multiple other places too, so it's not just like one evangelical Christian's arguing this.
Yeah.
There's destroyers of the gods out of University of Edinburgh, Larry Tucker. So like there's scholarship on this from multiple places.
Yeah.
It's not just one kind of person.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Kevin DeYoung's summarizing this, but Kyle Harper is just like an academic
Yeah.
who's like looking at history, asking really good questions.
So when
Okay.
you say 6 centuries, you mean 600 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So think the Roman Empire really like from the first 3 centuries. So first century, second century, third century. Second century is like 100 to 199. Third century is 200 to 299. By the time you get to the mid 300s, Constantine says, "I'm converted." Now listen, when Constantine does that, a lot of people say like, "Oh, Constantine converted," and all the Romans and all the pagans were like, "Oh, I guess we're Christians now." And it's like, that's not how anybody, if the government says, "Hey, you're all Muslim or Hindu," guess what? Nobody changes. The reality is, Stark says this, he's like, by the time Constantine said that, he looked around and went, more than 50% of my population in the Roman Empire is Christian. Puts the finger in the wind, goes, guess what? I'm Christian too. Okay? Do you see the political difference there? So what these guys are actually asking is what's the underlying conditions that cause this massive cultural shift? Okay? Make sense? All right. Sexual morality in the in the Roman Empire. So this is the first part. I can tell you right now, this is going to take a little longer. Here's what we're going to do. I'm probably not going to get to the last point. We'll save that for next week. But I think this is so important to help you understand the culture where you're going to start to go, oh my goodness, I can see why Christianity was a massive upgrade to Roman culture. All right, so you ready to learn about Roman culture? If you really want to read that book, it's stomach turning. How perverse Roman culture is. Unless you're a guy, a Roman, a noble. And even then, it was still pretty perverse.
An older guy.
An older guy, yeah. Yeah, exactly. You're going to find, okay, listen to this. We're talking about men. Same-sex relationships were common in the Roman world. Sounds enlightened, liberated, right? Just like us. No. What made them acceptable was not age and status dynamics. What made them acceptable or not was age and status dynamics. One piece of literature tells of its envisioning travel to the afterlife, where the Isle of the Blessed is described as a place where all the wives are shared in common without jealousy, and all the boys submit to their pursuers without resistance. So if you want to know what the Roman male, like, here's our ideal culture. I can have any women I want, and I can have all the boys I want. Okay? Pederasty, which is men pursuing boys, was not considered a problem. Neither was sexual fulfillment with slaves. Slaves, prostitutes, and boys were seen as perfectly legitimate outlets for male sexual desire. In an empire of 70 million, he says 7 to 10 million. I've seen, which is about 10 to 12%. I've seen numbers that say it's more like 20 to 30% were slaves. But the point is, slaves played something like the part that masturbation played in most cultures. There is no reference to like masturbation in Roman culture because none of them did it, because they all had access to slaves. Okay? Pederasty was common and widely approved by the Romans, with a few Stoics as exception. It was not shameful for boys to give themselves to older men, nor was it shameful for older men to pursue boys. What was shameful was for men to play the passive role in a homosexual relationship. You see the difference? It's actually, like, listen, it's fine. A man, no problem, as long as you're the one that's active. Okay? They were called effeminate or she-men, or acting like men during the day and behaving like girls at night if you were a passive partner. Do you see how warped this is? It's not at all like our version. What you see with same-sex relationships in our culture, this is not like that. It's about power. Okay? Jump down to the third paragraph. In other words, there are examples in the Roman world of long-lasting same-sex couples. It's not that all homosexuality was man-boy love. In fact, there's evidence that some same-sex pairs ritually enacted their own conjugal rights. At the same time, there never was, even in the sexually permissive Roman Empire, anything like gay marriage with an official legal standing. On the whole, Romans did not tolerate homosexuality, at least not for themselves. They were extremely tolerant of Roman men seeking out sexual pleasure from boys, slaves, and prostitutes. In other words, do you see the difference?
So they didn't even think of them as people to have a relationship with. So
That's right.
It wasn't a sexual preference, it was just a...
Yeah. They are not at all tolerant of free Roman men being penetrated. You see, in other words, that's the problem for them. You're a man, doesn't matter if you do it to somebody else, but don't you dare let somebody else do it to you. That is, do you see the divergence there? Okay. The viciousness of mainstream attitudes towards passivity is startling for anyone who approaches the ancient sources with a false anticipation that pre-Christian cultures were somehow more civilized towards sexual minorities. In other words, this culture's, for men, all about being masculine. Okay, what about for the women? As for the women, they were to be virgins before marriage and loyal, faithful wives within marriage. Very patriarchal. So patriarchal in the fact, and he doesn't mention this you read it in the book, that the women were actually still, like if a woman said, I want to buy a piece of property, it wasn't her husband who had to sign off, it was her father. The father still controls the woman's rights. The exception, when they got really, like you want to say like liberated, they're like, after she's had 3 kids, she can now own property and conduct business on her own. So there was a path, but it's very rare, okay? To pursue any other path, in other words, if you're a woman, so guys, if you're a noble Roman guy, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And there's a few exceptions, but like sex with slaves, that's not even sex. That's just blowing off steam. Okay? But for women, you better be a virgin when you're married, all right? And you are expected to be faithful, absolute chastity throughout your marriage to your husband. Okay, by the way, girls were married off the typical age for marriage, 12. And the men were usually 20 years older or more. All right?
Because, yeah, you had to, in order for you to own and, like, marry, your father had to die. And so you can't...
Your father has to be out of the picture.
In order for a man to be a man, their father has to die.
The
Then
fact that they see
get
like
married.
penetration in that way.
What'd you say?
The fact that they just like see being penetrated in that way, I think just tells you everything you need to know about how they view women.
Well, there's more.
Yeah.
Listen, when I was reading this book, he goes through and actually builds, you're like...
Because that's the woman's like default, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like that. Welcome to Roman sexuality. No, but it's worse, actually. Because it's not just men versus women. It's noble men versus... In other words, if you're a male slave, you're a nothing. You're property. You're a non... That's why it's no big deal. In other words, it's brutal. Okay, generally, let me finish this. Adultery was a crime against man because she was somebody else's property. It's either a crime against the husband or a crime against the father. Think about that. Not a crime against the woman. It's a crime against man. In other words, if your wife, if somebody like seduced your wife, okay, the whole legal thing that plays out is actually how that man that stole your wife has offended you as the husband and robbed you of your rights, your property. See how, like, you want to talk about a view of women? Brutal. Okay? The woman's chief virtue was, Blake, do you know how to pronounce this word in Latin? Pudicitia?
I don't know.
Okay, it means modesty. All right, and what I want you to think about is what word did we read in 1 Timothy? Modesty. In other words, what Paul is actually telling the women, and this guy comments on that in his book, he's like, it actually looked very, very similar to what the Romans were telling the women, but for completely different reasons. And it applied to a completely different group of people. Okay, so we'll get to that eventually. But the point is, what they want from their women, you need to be a virgin, you need to be faithful. It's all about modesty. Okay? So when they talk about Roman women wearing a veil, it's not like Islamic veils the way you think of. If you go look, just search for Greek and Roman statues, and anybody that's a noble woman will actually have, it's like a scarf. And it's not to cover them. It's a status symbol. It would be like a really like beautiful, like, it's like, you know how,
Jackie O.
yeah, exactly. It's like you've got to be a certain class to like wear this, and it tells everybody that you are like a good Roman wife. Okay, if somebody was caught in adultery, they could no longer wear that. Slaves, both sexes wore the toga, which is what men's wore. So, in other words, it's a status symbol, not like a concealment. Harper relates that from sexual maturity, women wear their hair veiled as a sign of modesty. They want you to be modest and chaste. Generally, there were laws insisting upon consent for free women, noble women, for both marriage and sex. There were also liberal divorce laws allowing men and women to unilaterally sue for divorce for almost any cause. We should not think that free Roman women were pining for sexual liberation. Women often promoted the value of modesty as much as anyone else. They used the ideal of chastity to their advantage in social networks. But this is free women, noble women.
Was there a view that 12-year-old girls could consent?
Of course.
Yeah.
The
What-
slave girls, there was actually a law where a slave girl, the owner of a slave girl couldn't have sex with her if she was a virgin, and so because that was considered rape. So what the men would do is they would just swap slave girls and trade them for money, and then you could do whatever you want after she's.
It's very, very brutal.
It was a horrible existence.
So prostitution was ubiquitous and uncontroversial. It was seen as a proper outlet for men's sexual energy. If a man had sex with prostitutes before marriage, it didn't mean he wasn't a virgin. Do you see that? They don't consider prostitutes human in the way that they saw. In other words, your chastity is entirely through nobility and class. Okay? Sex with prostitutes during marriage was not considered adultery. It was like their advice to the men was, hey, like, listen, at least try not to smell like the other women. In other words, don't have a good husband doesn't like waltz into the bedroom smelling obviously like he's just been with some other woman. That's how classy they are. Okay? One Christian bishop described Roman sexual policy as forbidding adulteries but building brothels. Prostitutes and slaves were essentially non-being. It was focused on class. It was thought, jump down to the middle of that last paragraph, if you remove prostitutes from civic life, you would overturn the whole social order. Lust would conquer. So their view of humanity was, this is how we run the empire. We need strong men who can do strong things because we are Romans. We've got to be able to conquer. And if they did not have a way to blow off steam, the entire empire would come apart at the seams.
Yeah, no self-control.
No self-control. In fact, they thought everything was like fate. You know, it's like the moon. The moon is bright tonight. I can't control myself. They literally, they were very, young women often reach sexual maturity. This is the third page. At an age of 12, were married soon after, while men often waited a considerable time after puberty before marriage. There were two main rules of sexual morality for free Roman men. Avoid adultery. In other words, whatever you do, don't sleep with another free man's wife. That'll cause problems because of a class thing. And avoid being the passive partner in homosexuality. Beyond that, everything's open. Whatever you want. Not a problem. Go for it. It's actually healthy. Okay? The sexual escapades of young men, and this is in their teens through the late 20s, provided that they were not with married women, were entirely inconsequential. Okay, marriage was important in late antiquity. There are even marriage was important in late antiquity. There are even examples of sentimental family. Romans did not usually marry for love, but they did want it to grow into love. Here then was the basic system of sexual morality in the Roman world. Early marriage for women, jealous guarding of honorable female sexuality, an expansive slave system, late marriages for men, and basically relaxed attitudes towards male sexual potential, so long as it was consonant with masculine protocols and social hierarchies. Okay, the value of the sexual act, in other words, right or wrongness, morality of the sexual act, derived first and foremost from its objective location within a class matrix of social relationships. Class. If you are a male and you are a nobleman, you can pretty much do whatever you want except for those couple of things. Everybody else, if you're a woman, you're expected to be utterly pure and chaste. And if you're a slave, you don't count. Prostitute, anything can be, you're just meat market. Okay? That's the Roman Empire. Who wants to go back and live there? It sounds terrible. All right? Let's talk about the Christian Empire. Okay? The Christian sexual ethic, it should be obvious, was radically different from mainstream Roman culture. Even the more conservative Stoics are not really precursors to Christian morality. Some of the language may be the same, but the ideas, the values, and the reason for Stoics ethics versus Christian ethics were entirely different. Sexual morality quickly became the great divide between Christians and the rest of the world. So if you want to know why the Bible talks about sex so much, particularly the New Testament, part of it is this is how Christians said we're actually different. It wasn't because they were prudes. You see what I'm saying? It's because they had a completely different worldview. All right? Christians inherited from Hellenistic Judaism an expansive category of porneia. You probably heard that word. That made little sense to the Romans. There would no longer be harmless, innocent outlets for male sexual desire. So listen, what Christians said to men, they're like, guess what, guys? You got to live to the same standard as the women do now. Rein it in. And go ahead.
So when you talk about the Roman Empire, do you also, when you lump in that moral ethic or whatever you want to call it around sex, do you also talk about the Jews, the male Jews who lived in that, or do
the Jews kept themselves separate? But he's going to say here, somewhere right in here, he actually says it's interesting. Monogamy was not so much a Jewish. Jews actually came out of a polygamous. You could have multiple wives. By this time, very few Jews did. But monogamy actually, in other words, Jews are kind of distinct.
So they weren't included in like this general
No.
Roman culture?
No. Jews would not have lived that way.
Okay.
And the Romans knew that Jews were different, so they'd look at this and go, this seems similar to what the Jews do, But the Jews don't like integrate with the Jews hold themselves separate. The Christians, it's everybody coming out of the Roman Empire and becoming Christian. And some of them are Jews, but many of them are pagans. Okay? Romans. All right. There is simply no avoiding the conclusion that Christianity presented a sexual ethic that was radically new. This was felt poignantly when it came to attitudes towards homosexual behavior. Now, this is a quote here. Please hear this. For the historian, any hermeneutic roundabout that tries to sanitize or soften Paul's words is likely to obscure the inflection point. Here's what he's saying. If you're a scholar and you're actually going to pay attention to your history, if you try to soft pedal this, you're going to end up being a bad historian. He's like, it's inescapable. This was the pivot point for the culture. Like, as Christianity kind of said, we're pursuing an alternate culture. This is it. And it came with, so what they did was they stuck with, well, let me read it. The new inflection point was Paul's overriding sense of gender rather than age or status. And I would just add the word here, gender plus marriage. In other words, sex is between male and female, and it's got to be in the context of marriage.
Where are you? I'm sorry.
I am on the third paragraph from the bottom under sexual morality in the Christian Empire.
Okay.
Okay. That was the chief factor in whether a sexual act was licit or not. Does it happen in marriage? Is it male, female? Okay. Anything outside of that, there was no place for sex with men, boys, married women, singles, slaves, free. So Christianity, now that's way more restrictive than the Roman culture. Okay? But from Paul onward, this is the second to last paragraph, Christian sexual morality collapsed all forms of same-sex contact, whether pederistic or companionate, into one category. Nature was seen as that which corresponded to social norms. With Christianity, nature would be that which corresponded to gendered morality of sex. Last paragraph. Harper argues that Christian sexuality led to a new understanding of the freedom of the will. Everybody, even the guys, has the ability to control their bodies. They're like, you want to be a man? Start acting like it. Exert self-control. So, marriage was critical, of course. Monogamy. Harper argues monogamy is more of a Roman ideal than a Jewish one. A single conjugal unit was considered the norm for free Romans, even if men were allowed all sorts of exceptions that didn't count against the unit. Christianity refined Roman monogamy to eliminate any other kind of sexual experience. Here then is the basic system of sexual morality in the Christian age. Virginity was ideal. Marriage was acceptable. Sex beyond marriage was sinful. Same-sex eros, desire, categorically forbidden. The most astonishing development of late antiquity is the transformation of a radical sexual ideology, for centuries the possession of a small band of vociferous dissenters, being absorbed into a culture broadly shared public framework of values and meaning. In other words, take that really restrictive view, in other words, it's way more restrictive than the Romans, and go, how on earth did that become mainstream? That's the question. Winners and losers. The triumph of the Christian sexual ethic would be unthinkable except that it actually happened. Jump down to the middle of the second paragraph under that. Sexual behavior went from the background to the foreground of ethical concern. Sexual deviance went from something with social ramifications. So in the Roman culture, if you deviate from sexual expectations, okay, that has social ramifications. In the Christian culture, that's a sin that was grievous in the sight of God, could have eternal ramifications. Marriage, which was always understood in the Roman world as the union between a man and a woman, became the only appropriate outlet for sexual activity. Look at the paragraph that starts, if there were winners and losers. If there were winners and losers in the Christian transformation of sexual morality, you could say that gay men and promiscuous Roman males were the losers, while women, slaves, prostitutes, and young boys were the big winners. And then what he's going to go on and say is the culture shifted. I'm going to stop there. Okay. Do you see the cultural change, first of all? So here's where we're going to go.
An argument why it changed?
No, I haven't got to that part in the book yet. And so basically, he does not summarize. So this is what we're going to do, and we're going to finish this next week. But we can talk about it today if you want, and I can give you some. Here's where we're going to go next with the text in 1 Timothy. Clearly, needs another week. I can give you at least 5 things out of that text that would have been really significant to Roman women and also to Roman men, I think, but mostly to women, where they would have been like, oh my gosh, this is a good thing. I'm going to tell you what they are. Number 1, the whole basis of beauty changes. Okay? Number 2, virtue changes. Think about this. Who could even have virtue in the Roman culture? Only an upper class woman who never, ever, ever failed or was accused of failure. And Christians take that notion of virtue and they go, that is accessible to the poor, to women of any class, and even women that have failed or that have been failed can have their virtue restored because Jesus came to deal with sin and to free do you see what I'm saying? Like, they took this concept that's only for the elite performers and they actually said this applies to anybody that's willing to follow Jesus. So you've got redefinition of beauty, redefinition of virtue, redefinition of work, redefinition of learning, redefinition of family. Let me end with this. We haven't done much talking. Do you feel like you've got a...
So next week we're going to talk about...
I'm going to unpack those.
Redefinition.
Yeah.
And then, like, are we also going to talk about, like, what it means for us today?
I'm trying to get there.
Okay.
Part of the reason we're moving slowly on this
It's fascinating.
is most people move way too quickly, and so they do sweeping, broad brush generalizations, and I think it's actually helpful to look at what's going on behind it. So let me conclude with this. I'm like skipping 2 pages of really interesting stuff. At the heart of the Roman Empire, do you guys know what the word telos is? Have you heard that Greek word telos? So telos is like destination. It's the thing you're aiming for. So if you're going to shoot a bow and the arrow's trying to hit the target, the telos is it's like, where is something going? The heart of the Roman Empire, telos, is really about the empire and it's about power. To the victor go the spoils. So who does it favor? The strong. And who are the strong? The men. Okay? The men that built and ran the empire. Whatever power, whatever you had the power to do, you could do it. And it was actually like appreciated because you had power. You see what I'm saying? So if you did something really deviant, but you were powerful enough, people would still honor it. They're like, wow, that was great. Power. Okay? And empire. Now listen, the heart of the American experiment. Do you know what our telos really is?
Self-fulfillment.
What'd you say?
Self-fulfillment.
Self-fulfillment. I would say, I'd say individual freedom and self-fulfillment. In other words, everybody should have the power to do what you want. Each individual gets to be their own little empire. And in all honesty, really our cultural argument today is, hey, it's not fair for just the guys to have that. The women should have the right to do the same thing. And I'm serious. That's what it is. Women and the guys should both be identical. Okay? It's not aimed at power, it's aimed at like autonomy. Okay? Where you get to choose what you want for yourself. At the heart of early Christianity, the telos is about the resurrection and the kingdom that is coming, and it's here and now, and we get to be a part of it, men and women as partners. But Jesus is the one we're living for, not ourselves. Not our kingdoms, not our self-fulfillment. It's about what Jesus is doing, both men and women. And I think one of the questions just to leave us with is like, how many of us actually feel like we're doing that in our relationships? Partnership, living for the kingdom. That's the Christian vision. And so the question is like, okay, how do we continue to try to understand it, but maybe move